Good evening.
Good evening.
Certainly glad to have the opportunity to assemble together with you again this evening, that we can continue our worship together. I hope that you still have your bulletin from this morning or pick one up on your way in this evening. We'll use the outline provided for you there in the middle to help you follow along. If you can open that up, or if the screen is warmed up, you can see we're going to continue what we began last Sunday evening. We began to talk about King David and the lessons that we can learn from his life. We're going to talk about his suffering here this evening and the lessons that we can learn from it as we attempt to live faithfully to God through the sufferings that we might face. As we talked about a little bit last week, when we think about David, probably the first story that comes to your mind is David and Goliath. Well, we covered that last week. But one of the things that probably isn't the first thing to come to your mind about King David is the suffering that he endured. If you stop and think about it, you probably do remember some of the things that he dealt with that caused him some problems. But that's probably not the first thing that pops in your mind when you think of King David. But if you stop and read through the book of 1 Samuel here, as we're going to hit some of the highlights of here this evening, you'll recognize pretty quick that David's life was actually pretty full of suffering. He suffered probably to a degree that maybe few, if any of us, will or have endured in our life. So we're going to look at a few of the things that David suffered here this evening, and I hope to gain from this brief study a greater understanding and a greater appreciation for the things that David endured, for the character that he displayed in the midst of his suffering, and gain from that a greater determination that we might endure with faithfulness to God through the sufferings that we might have to face in this life. So as we said, we looked last week at the fact that David went to the battle. Goliath challenged the army of Israel to send out a champion to face him in single combat, and nobody in the entire camp of the army of Israel was brave enough to go out and to fight Goliath. They were all afraid, even King Saul. And so David volunteered, and he went out, and through his faith in God, God gave him a great victory over Goliath. But you would think that that would be the start of a great life for David. His faith in God, God giving him victory, but really the victory that he won over Goliath was kind of the root of everything that David suffered from this point forward in many respects. It starts here with that story. His victory over Goliath was the beginning of his suffering. So we looked at chapter 17 last week here in the book of 1 Samuel and the victory that David won. And then we turn and begin looking in chapter 18. And we see the reaction that the people of Israel had to David's great victory over Goliath. Look at verses 6 and 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 18. It says, "It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens thousands.'" And so we look at that praise that they're heaping upon David greater than King Saul, and you can understand, I think, what happened next. Saul became very jealous. Look at the next verse, verses 8 and 9. "Then Saul became very angry for this saying, displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on." So this person who moments ago had saved the nation of Israel and King Saul's own life, now he has decided is his enemy, because his jealousy at the people praising David to a higher degree than himself. And so what we see then is almost instantaneously, Saul begins to try to kill David. Look at the next two verses. 1 Samuel 18, verses 10 and 11. "Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing the harp with his hand, as usual, and the spear was in Saul's hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. So David here was simply doing what he had been asked to do. He was playing the harp for King Saul, and Saul tried to kill him by throwing a spear at him. I don't think it was a friendly gesture, right? He was trying to kill him. And so, here is David, who has just saved the whole nation, and King Saul is right now doing what King Saul's asked him to do, playing the harp for him, and he tries to kill him because of his jealousy. So King Saul is very jealous. The jealousy has led to attempted murder, but David, through the providence of God, escapes on this occasion. But Saul isn't done. Of course, as you remember, he continues to try to get rid of David for a very long time, very persistently. If you continue looking at this chapter here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, what you'll see is that Saul attempted to see David killed by the Philistines in battle. How did he do that? Well, look at verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battle." So Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So he calls upon David to lead the armies of Israel into battle. And he figures, well, sooner or later, the Philistines will get him, and I won't have to do it. And so he's very much attempting to see that David is killed in battle, hoping that David will be killed. Keep reading verses 20 and 21. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him, so Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David for a second time, you may be my son-in-law. Skip down to verse 25. Saul said then, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. So he says, okay, David, I'll let you marry my daughter, but to have that right, you have to go out and you have to fight and kill 100 Philistines and bring back proof that you've done that. Well, going out and killing 100 Philistines was a difficult task, to put it mildly. And so Saul, of course, was hoping that David would fail in that task and would be killed in this effort to secure the hand of Michal, Saul's younger daughter, in marriage. But of course that failed as well. David was successful. He was able to return with the prize that he was sent for, and he was successful. So the Philistines didn't kill David as Saul had hoped. So Saul finally decides, well, the Philistines apparently aren't going to get him. I'll have to try again. Look at chapter 19 and verse 11. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. And you can go through the rest of the passage and see how David escaped there. But the point of the matter is, essentially, he had put a contract out on David's life. Anybody that wanted to kill him, he was fine with. Whoever wanted to do it. And so he sent his servants, his own allies, to David's house to wait and to kill him as soon as he walked out of his door of the morning, unsuspected. And so we see all of these things that Saul attempted to do. And basically what happens at this point is, if you keep reading down through this passage here in chapter 19, what you'll see is that David had to escape, and he has to flee for his life. As his wife Michal tells him he must there in verse 11 as we read. And so from this point forward in David's life, he's on the run. He has to literally run for his life from King Saul, who's chasing him, hunting him down, trying to kill him for years, it seems, from this point forward. Tenaciously, he chases him all over the countryside. And so we see the root of David's suffering goes back to the victory he won over Goliath, but really the root of the problem is the jealousy of King Saul. God has decided that he wants David to be the next king, not Saul. And Saul is not willing to listen to God. He wants to maintain his power and begin a dynasty with his sons following him on the throne. And he's not interested in God's plan for David to become the next king. And so much so that he's willing to kill David to protect his political interests. Good thing we don't have that problem today. Anyway, so the next thing we want to consider here is what all of this suffering happened. What happened to David, what it cost him, what he lost because of Saul's jealousy. So as we said, David at this time wasn't really, when we first meet him there in chapter 17, he wasn't employed in the army. He becomes that afterwards. But really his job at this point, Saul had called him to come and to play the harp for him. But as you can understand, that job is gone now. So, that sounds like a pretty cushy job if you can get it, right? Just playing the harp for the king. But he loses that job. Look at chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul, and he was sitting in the house with his spear in his hand. This is a different passage than the one we read a minute ago in chapter 18. And David was playing the harp with his hand. Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, so that he stuck the spear in the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Right? So David had a nice job there playing the harp for King Saul. That job's gone. Saul's jealousy has taken that position away. As we've already said, David was married to Saul's daughter Michal, but as we saw there in chapter 19, verses 11 and following, David has to flee from the house that he shared there with his wife Michal and run away from King Saul, who's trying to kill him. And there appears to never be an occasion where David and his wife are reunited, not that I found anyway, from that point forward. And then if you skip down to verse 25, chapter 25. No, here we are. Where are we at? No, yeah, chapter 25. Look at verse 44. 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 44, at the end of that chapter. Look what it says. Now Saul had given Michal his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galilee. So David lost his wife. She was taken from him and given to somebody else by her father. So he's lost his position. He's lost his wife. Also, what we want to notice here in chapter 19 is where David goes when he has to flee that night from his house. Look at verse 18 of chapter 19. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 19 where we were a minute ago and look at verse 18. It says, Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he stayed and went, and he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth, or something to that effect. And so the point is, David trusted and knew Samuel as a prophet of God. And so when he needed help, when he needed advice, when he needed someone to be on his side, he ran to Samuel. But look what happens at the beginning of the next chapter. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life? So he went and he stayed for a little while with Samuel. But then he leaves and he goes and tries to figure out what the situation is by talking to Jonathan, Saul's son. And then if we keep reading, again, if we go to chapter 25, chapter 25, where we were a second ago, look, instead of the last verse, look at the first verse of chapter 25. Chapter 25 and verse 1, it says, Then Samuel died, and all Israel gathered together and mourned for him, including David. And so as we look at again, the intervening time period, I didn't find another reference where David got to go back and to be with Samuel, because again, he was on the run for his life. And everybody knew that Samuel was on his side, and they were watching Samuel. And so if David had gone back to Samuel, they probably would have caught him. So at this point, this mentor, this spiritual advisor, this friend that he had in Samuel, he can't even go back and talk to him now because of King Saul's jealousy. So he loses that relationship. We saw a second ago in chapter 20 and verse 1 how he went to King Saul's son Jonathan and talked to him. Here in chapter 20, we see a whole extended series of events where Jonathan and David are trying to figure out just how serious Saul is about killing him, and they finally come to the conclusion David can't stay around there. He has to leave. And what we see in this chapter is the great friendship that existed between David and Jonathan. But again, David is forced to flee from King Saul. He's forced to leave the area where Jonathan is. Jonathan, of course, is caught in this terrible position between his friend and his father, and he sides with David, and that makes his father very angry with him. But David loses essentially this relationship with his friend Jonathan because he has to flee from King Saul, and that severs him from being able to have any association or find any comfort in his friendship with Jonathan. And so he's lost his best friend as well. And then we get to a very peculiar part of the story. Look at chapter 21. And in chapter 21, I want to read starting in verse 10. Chapter 21 and verse 10, it says, Then David arose and fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Stop there for a second. Remember where Goliath was from? Very peculiar that he would go to the city where Goliath was from, one of these Philistine cities, one of these kings that he's been fighting against. But he goes there because I guess he's thinking Saul would never expect me to go here. He would never come here looking for me. He would never expect this. So I don't know exactly what his reasoning was, but he goes to one of these Philistine kings, to their city of Gath. Look at verse 11. But the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David, the king of the land? So they recognize that God has anointed David as king. Saul doesn't, but the Philistines do. Finish verse 11. Did they not sing of this one as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish the king of Gath. So he's there. He's afraid, though. So how does he respond? Look at verse 13. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gates and let his saliva run down onto his beard. Then Achish said to the servants, his servants, Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act as a madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house? And so, David is gone there. He really has nowhere else to go. I mean, think about who can he turn to? Most of the citizens, of course, are going to be loyal to King Saul. He can't trust them not to turn him in. Sometimes people attempt to do that very thing throughout this whole section of David's life. And so he goes to his own enemy to look for a place of refuge. But to find safety there, he can't come in there and act normal. He has to essentially sacrifice his dignity and act like a madman, act like he's crazy, a lunatic, not sound in the head, to be able to be safe there in this town. And so it's a very peculiar part of the story, but it's just another thing that David essentially has to lose because of King Saul's jealousy. He has to give up his dignity. And so as we look through this story, again, we're just barely hitting the highlights here of David's life at this time period, focusing on the things that he's suffering at this time period. But as we look at the suffering that David is enduring here, what we don't see is him rejecting God. What we don't see is him saying, well, God's not protecting me, God's not taking care of me, I'm going to just give up on my faith in God. No, that never happens. David continues to be a man of faith throughout this whole situation. And so as we look at David's life and the suffering that he endured and his response to it, I think there's some lessons that we can learn about how we can go through this life and endure the sufferings that we might have to face while learning from the example of David. So one of the things that we see, I think, very clearly in Scripture and in our own lives is the reality is that life isn't always fair, right? Sometimes we get really frustrated and say, well, that's not fair. That shouldn't have happened. This shouldn't be the way things are in my life. Well, think about David. What had he done wrong? What had he done to bring all this suffering upon himself? Nothing, right? All he's done here so far is do what God called him to do and go out and tackle Goliath there. He's been faithful to his father. He's been faithful to King Saul. And, we could talk about all the occasions where David had the opportunity to retaliate against Saul and refused to do so. Now, what has David done wrong to bring all this suffering upon himself? Not a thing. So if someone wants to say, well, life isn't fair, I think David could say that. David could say, well, life's not fair. But when we think about the reality that life isn't always fair, we have to recognize that even though life isn't always fair, God is still righteous. You know, one of the obvious questions, anytime a person goes through a time of suffering like David's enduring here, or we have suffering in our life, the natural response is to ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is God allowing this bad thing to happen to me? Life's so unfair. Why is God allowing this to happen? There's an interesting part of the Old Testament. There's one of the minor prophets. His name is Habakkuk. And he is writing during the time period when the Babylonians are coming and have destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple and carried away many of the Jews into captivity. And that is exactly his question. He wants to know, God, why did you allow this to happen? He doesn't understand why the nation, why his people are suffering, and why God let it happen. So we don't have the time to really dig into the book of Habakkuk today, but I suggest that you do some study and consider what you can learn from that short book. It's only 3 chapters long. But his bottom line is simply this. I don't understand, but I'm going to trust God. I don't understand why. That was his question. Why? He never got an answer. God didn't tell him. But his response was simply, okay, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust. And so God is righteous. He's going to do what is right. And so we can trust him even though life isn't always fair. And sometimes we will suffer even though it doesn't seem like we ought to have to endure such things. The second thing we want to consider is the fact that suffering's not always bad. You know, obviously we think of suffering, we think of it as a bad thing, as a negative thing, but there can come some positive results out of suffering that we might have to endure. Consider a passage of Scripture from Psalm 119. Turn there with me if you would. Psalm 119. Do you remember Psalm 119 is that one that's really long? I think it's 179 verses or something like that. We're not going to read all of those. That would be maybe some suffering. We'd be here a little while, wouldn't we? But look at a few verses here. Look at verses 67, 68, and 71. 67 and 68 here in Psalm 119. The inspired author writes, Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. So the author is saying, before he went through this difficult circumstance, whatever it was that he was facing, he says he was going the wrong way. But that through the process of the suffering that he endured, he realized that he needed to turn and to follow God, and is asking God to help him learn how to do that. Look at verse 71. He concludes by saying, It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. Right? Oftentimes, when we suffer through a difficult time, it can help us maybe to refocus our priorities on doing right, on following God. And that's what the psalmist is saying here. And so, yes, suffering, it's not something maybe we look forward to, but it can be an occasion where we learn something. And so it's not always all bad. Another similar thought to that is found in a couple of New Testament passages. Turn first with me, if you would, to Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. You might remember this verse in the midst of a passage of Scripture where Paul is giving some practical exhortations to us as Christians. He says to us in verse 15 here in Romans chapter 12, Romans 12:15, Paul says simply, Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I think it's, much more easy to understand what someone's going through and to weep with them and to sympathize with them if you have been through difficult times yourself. If you've never had a bad day, how could you help somebody who's going through something rough, right? And so if we've been through difficult times, then we can sympathize and empathize with those who have been are going through something difficult. And that's the same basic premise that Paul talks about in a little bit greater extent in the first chapter of 2 Corinthians. Turn there with me if you would. 2 Corinthians 2 Corinthians, we're going to look at verses 3 and following. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 3, Paul says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ." So Paul is saying here, yes, we're going to suffer because we're Christians. We're going to suffer in this life. But when we receive comfort from God in the midst of our sufferings, what that does is it essentially prepares us for service. It teaches us how to then show comfort and encouragement to other people. Because we've endured suffering, we've come through on the other side, trusting in God, receiving comfort from Him, and we can share that with those who we see around us who are struggling as well. And so we learn how to serve God in this world, sometimes through the suffering that we endure. The final point that I want to consider with you all this evening is simply this. When we go through a difficult time, and again we trust in God in the midst of our difficulties, we can learn about the omnipotence of God. Sometimes the sufferings that we are in, the circumstances that we face, they feel overwhelming. Like we're not going to be able to come through on the other side. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, as the saying goes. But when we trust in God in the midst of our struggles, and we do persevere through them with God's help, we can learn about His omnipotence. There is no struggle that we're going to face. There is no problem that we will endure that God cannot help us to overcome. He is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. That's what that word means. And so we learn about God's omnipotence. We learn about His power and His willingness to take care of us and to answer our prayers in the midst of our struggles. And so as we think about the suffering that David endured in his life, it wasn't fair, and yet God was with him through it all. David was able to survive all of the attempts of King Saul to take his life, and finally he was able to come to the point where he was able to take over as the king of Israel. Saul was killed in battle, and he united the entire nation together, and under David's leadership was the high point, the glory of the whole nation of Israel. And so there was a lot of good that came at the end of this suffering that David had to endure that we've talked about here today. And so as we think about all of the suffering that we might endure in this life, we recognize that at the end of these things that there is something better waiting for us. You might remember Revelation chapter 21 and verse 4. "And He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away." That's Revelation chapter 21 and verse 4. And so as we think about what awaits us at the end of our suffering, what awaits us is the promise of eternal life that God has given to us, the promise of a time where we will be with Him and there will be no more pain, and no more sadness, no more death, no more suffering. What a glorious thing to think that at the end of the sufferings of this life, there's an eternity that awaits where there will be no more suffering. And we will be in the presence of God forever. A God who loves us, a God who sent Christ to the cross to purchase our salvation so that we can have that hope of an eternity of joy and peace in the presence of God. Maybe there's one here who needs to respond to Lord's invitation to put on Christ so that you can have that hope, a hope free of suffering. Maybe there's one here who needs to respond to Lord's invitation to be restored. If you need to come, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing.